Hello, everyone. Welcome to class PS class number 4. I was wondering if everyone can see my screen.
Yep, we can.
Okay, thank you. Uh, so today we'll be going over personality, motivation, emotion, and stress. And this is uh, just the reminders. Just making sure. Yeah, it's recording. And we would like to make these sessions as interactive as possible. So if you would like to explain your answer, please type a asterisk next to your answer in the chat so that we know it's okay to call on you. So before we start the session today, I just have a few warm-up questions via Khan Academy. And so for question number one, in terms of these Khan Academy questions, you could type your answer in the chat, and that would be great, like A, B, C, or D, and then we can discuss them after a minute. Yeah. So we'll just be discussing this question after 1 or 2 minutes. You can type your answers in the chat. So I see one C in the chat. If you would, if it's okay with you, would you like to explain your answer or?
Sure, I can.
Okay.
Um, so basically, we know that her grandfather, like she lost a loved one due to smoking, and like she thinks it's horrible, but she's still doing it herself. So out of all of these, cognitive dissonance is like the first one that jumped out at me because it's when you have like these thoughts that are sort of in conflict in your head with like what you're doing and what you actually believe. So
Yeah, that's a great explanation. So that is the answer, cognitive dissonance, as there's she believes smoking is disgusting, but then she has, which is a attitude, and then the behavior, which is she smokes as well. So it's like they're not incongruent. So that's when the contradiction or cognitive dissonance happens. So question number two, the same thing. After 1 or 2 minutes, we'll discuss it. Are there any other responses in the chat? So we have 1B, which is foot in the door phenomenon, which is the right answer. So in discussing, so in looking for the answer for this question, there's after this initial small compliance, the salesperson will then ask the customer to do bigger things. And this is sort of going along the lines of the foot in the door phenomenon, where you agree to do a small thing and then they ask the person or group, they ask for larger things in afterwards. So then you're more likely to agree to those things. This is question number 3. This one we can discuss after 1 minute. So I see 1A in the chat. So according to Freud, which part of our personality are we born with that allows our basic needs to be met? So there's id, ego, and superego, and which are the three things that Freud really uh, discusses as part of his theories, etc. So id is sort of like your instincts and your basic needs and we're born with it. And ego is sort of what deals with the id, and superego and tries to meet in the middle ground, and superego is sort of the moral values of society telling you to do the right thing. So in this question, the correct answer would be id A. And we have one question in terms of emotions. So which of these theories of emotion does this flowchart correctly describe? So I see 1B in the chat. So this is the correct answer. So uh, we'll be discussing. So any tips on keeping them straight would be really helpful. So that's a that's a great point. We'll be discussing this later on in the presentation, and there's a good diagram that I'll share regarding the 4 theories of emotion for this session. And lastly, the question number 5, which of these questions would an individual ask during the secondary appraisal according to Lazarus and Folkman's cognitive appraisal method? Yep. B is the correct answer. So it's, do I have the resources to deal with this? So in thinking about the primary and secondary appraisal for stress, the primary is, it's thinking about, is this a threat to myself? Uh, is this going to cause any harm or a threat? And secondary appraisal is, do I have the resources to deal with it? And then you deal with it or you flee, and there's other things you can do as well. But that's the secondary appraisal. So today's session overview is motivation, attitude and behavior, personality, emotion, and stress. And after each of these 5 sections, I'll just be open to any questions you have. So motivation asks the question why. Why do we do the thing and why do we feel the way we do? So motivation has 5 schools of thought and approaches. First is the evolutionary approach. It's the role instincts play in motivation. What humans do to survive. It's something that's just instinct, so it's not learned. So think about baby cries, sleep, eating, etc. So basic instincts that all humans have. Second is the drive reduction theory or drive theory, which focuses on drives versus needs. So need is a lack or deprivation that will energize the drive. The drive is the aroused state. Fulfilling the drive will reduce the need. This need drive balance is what maintains a homeobalance, homeostasis. Typically basic, essential, and physiological. For example, you're at a gym and a need for water. The trainer says you need to do more exercise. In this example, the need is water, the drive is thirst. The drive is thirst, and doing push-ups is means to fulfill the drive for water. Number 3 is optimal arousal theory. People want to reach full arousal or alertness, the drive to get full arousal and a natural high, so a state that we enjoy. For example, this is why people go to amusement parks to have like this optimal arousal. Fourth is the cognitive theory, which is rational and decision-making ability, so thought process that drive behavior. And number 5 is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So we want to satisfy needs in a particular order. So it starts from the bottom to the top of the pyramid. First is physiological needs, then safety needs, belongingness and love needs, esteem needs, and finally self-actualization. So Freud also looked at motivation, and it's the something we discussed before, which was the id, ego, and superego. So id is innate. It's the reservoir for all psychic energy. The id seeks to discharge tension arising from internal needs or external stimulation. It's made up of all instincts and wants to get rid of all uncomfortable feelings. This is called the drive reduction theory. And it also ties in with the pleasure principle to gain pleasure or avoid pain. Ego is the reality principle. It operates on secondary processes, so it's reality testing. It mediates the demands of reality versus the desires of the id. And the ego is also known as the self, and this is who we identify with or believe ourselves to be. Finally, the superego. It's the internalization of cultural ideals and parental sanctions. So morals, the interjection and internalization. The superego inhibits sexual and aggressive impulses and tries to replace striving for perfection. So you can think about the ego, superego, and id in terms of what's conscious and unconscious. So the ego is part unconscious and part conscious. And the superego is also part conscious and unconscious. But the unique something to keep in mind is that the ego is completely unconscious. There's nothing in the consciousness. So it's like instincts, all these drives that we have. The incentive theory of motivation calls attention to how factors
I'm
outside of
sorry, can you go
individuals.
back to the last slide?
Yeah,
One more.
yeah.
Okay, because give me one.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Incentive theory of motivation calls attention to how factors outside of individuals, including community values and other aspects of culture, can motivate behavior. So there's two things to keep in mind is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation is associated with rewards or obligated behavior. Extrinsic motivation is motivation to do something based on an external reward, like money or fame. And intrinsic motivation is internal motivation. So it's something you really want to do. So drive reduction motivation is similar to the drives we discussed before, is the motivation based on the need to fulfill a certain drive like hunger or thirst. And A motivation is the lack of motivation. So I was wondering if anyone had any questions for the motivation section.
Yeah. Can you go back to the id, ego,
Yeah.
superego slide? I have some trouble sometimes thinking about like the nuance between the ego and superego, because when it comes to like application questions, sometimes I can get the two confused because it seems like both of them work to mediate the id and like make sure it isn't too out of control. But I never know like, which one to pick when it comes to those kind of questions.
Yeah. So I had a professor that provided like a good example of like the id is sort of like the devil, and then the superego is like the angel on the other shoulder, but ego is in the middle. So the id is always opposing the superego, and the id is something that you want, like, or you're going to throw a tantrum, sort of like a baby. And the superego is sort of like your parents, where they always preach the importance of morals and really striving for perfection. And ego sort of like takes the id and superego and tries to come to a compromise. So balancing the immediate gratification versus long-term gratification.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. So now we're going on to attitude and behavior. So what is attitude? Attitude is a learned tendency to evaluate things in a certain way. To evaluate people, issues, events, and objects, we think of attitude as someone having certain view towards a certain topic. So we can break down attitude into three components called the ABC model of attitude. These three components shape our attitude. So one is affective or emotional, second is behavioral, and third is the cognitive component. So the affective or emotional component, we feel or have emotions about a certain object, topic, or subject. For example, I am scared of spiders. Second is behavioral. How do we act or behave towards the object or subject? I'll avoid spiders and scream if I see one. So that's a behavior. And finally, the cognitive component. So it's thoughts and beliefs, and have a knowledge about the subject or topic that will influence and shape our attitude. For example, I believe spiders are dangerous. So this is a belief or cognition that you have, and it's not really behavior or emotion. So for example, I love yoga because I get to meditate and I believe it helps me relax. So I will go to class each week. So I love yoga is emotional or affective. I believe it helps me relax is cognitive, and behavioral is I will go to class each week. Second is I am frightful of roller coasters and believe they are stupid, so I will be on the carousel. So the affective is I am frightful, which is emotion. Behavioral is I will be on the carousel, so you'll physically walk over to the carousel. And cognition is I believe they are stupid, which is a thought or a belief. So four theories that answer the question, how do our attitudes influence behavior? The first theory is the theory of planned behavior. So here you should just keep in mind the importance of intentions and implications. We consider our implications of our actions before we decide on how to behave. The best predictor of our behavior is the strength of these intentions and implications. So intentions are based on three things. Number one is our attitudes towards a certain behavior, such as I like or favor studying. Second is subjective norms, what we think others think about our behavior. For example, my friends think studying is a waste of time. And lastly, perceived behavioral control, how easy or hard we think it is to control our behavior. For example, I have to work 40 hours this week on top of studying. So in this example, the attitude is positive, so you like studying, but the behavior of studying is low because you're also working a lot during the week, and also your friends think studying is a waste of time, so that can also influence your behavior as well. Second is the attitude to behavior process model. So it essentially just explains the attitude straight to behavior. So an event triggers our attitude, something that will influence our perception of an object. Then the attitude, some other knowledge together determines behavior. For example, Tommy has an attitude that junk food is unhealthy because many of his relatives have heart-related diseases associated with poor eating habits. So when he's at home, he does not eat chips, soda, or candy because his knowledge is that these foods are bad for his health and maintains a healthy lifestyle no matter where he is. So the unhealthy attitude, which is triggered by an event, plus knowledge leads to behavior. Third is the prototype willingness model. It says that behavior is a function of six things, the combination of which influence our behavior. Our behavior is a function of one, past behavior. Second is attitudes. Third is subjective norms. Fourth is our intentions. Fifth is our willingness to engage. And sixth is prototypes and modeling. Lastly is the elaboration likelihood model for persuasion. So it's more of a cognitive approach and focuses on the why and how of persuasion. So two ways in which information is processed, the central route or the peripheral route of persuasion. The central route of persuasion is the degree of attitude change depends on the quality of the arguments by the persuader. How much we are persuaded depends on the quality of the persuasion. So the argument and words are central. Peripheral route of persuasion looks at superficial expertise, non-verbal persuasion cues such as attractiveness or status of the persuader. So one example you can keep in mind is the central route of persuasion is, let's say you're listening to an undergrad presenter thesis, they're presenting their thesis. So the actual arguments or words is the central route of persuasion. But if you're judging their presentation and you're really looking at the attractiveness of their PowerPoint slides, then that's sort of like the peripheral route of persuasion. It's also possible for our behaviors to shape our attitudes. Strong social pressures can weaken attitudes to behavior connection and can cause our attitudes to follow our behavior. So one example is the foot in the door phenomenon, which we discussed with the warm-up question. We have a tendency to agree to small actions first. Eventually, over time, we comply with much larger actions. The door is eventually pushed completely open over time, and society behaviors strongly feed into your attitude. Second is role playing. So everyone plays many different roles in life. And so now picture yourself in a new role, such as a parent or a new job. And in the first few days of the role, you feel a bit strange or fake because we're trying to follow a social quota in that role. We're trying to fit the role and sound professional, but over time, what feels like acting or behavior, it starts to feel like you. So it turns into your attitude. So our behavior of playing this role influences our attitude over time, and what feels like acting starts to feel like you and begins to fit your attitude. So cognitive dissonance, we also discussed at the beginning. It's the discomfort experienced when holding two or more conflicting attitudes or actions. These conflicting ideas lead to feelings of discomfort, which we want to alleviate. So there's 4 things we can do to reduce the cognitive discomfort associated with cognitive dissonance. So for example, a smoker says, I smoke, which is thought or cognition 1, and learns that smoking can lead to cancer, so cognition 2. In light of this new information, 4 things can occur. Number 1 is that you can modify your cognitions. So change in the cognition or thinking process in a person's actions or behavior to reduce the discomfort a person has with the attitude or behavior. For example, the smoker might say, I really don't smoke that much. So the person went from I smoke to I really don't smoke that much. Second is trivialize, which is make less important or make it trivial and change the importance of their cognition. For example, the person might say, evidence is weak that smoking causes cancer. Third is add information, so adding more cognitions to make contradictions more comfortable. For example, I exercise, so much it doesn't matter. So that's the cognition. So you added another cognition to deal with the cognitive dissonance of smoking and learning that smoking is linked with cancer. And fourth is denying facts. So the smoker might say there's no evidence that smoking and cancer are linked. So the key point is that people strive for harmony in our thoughts, actions, and words. As soon as our cognitions, our attitudes, and behaviors don't align, we have cognitive dissonance. So we modify our cognitions to reduce cognitive discomfort. We don't change our behavior. So I was wondering if anyone had any questions for the attitude and behavior section.
Can you just go back to the previous slide really quickly? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So now we're moving on to theories of personality. There's 6 theories I'll be going over just quickly, but there's more information in your readings. So first is a psychoanalytic perspective, so developed by Sigmund Freud, says that our personalities are comprised of unconscious memories, emotions, and thoughts. It is thought of that our dreams reveal elements of our unconscious. So whenever I think of Freud, I always think about id, ego, superego, and that's really what he's associated with. Second is humanistic perspective developed by Carl Rogers, says that the human nature is inherently good and that we have free will. Our behavior is not determined or based on our past, like Sigmund Freud would say. And third is the trait perspective, says that our personality is determined by the presence and absence of differing levels of traits or characteristics. Fourth is a biological perspective, says that at least part of our personality is predetermined by our genetic makeup. Fifth is our behaviorist perspective, says that our personalities are produced by patterns of behavior that we learn according to our environment. So if we grow up with parents that behave supportively, we are more likely to be supportive parents ourselves. And sixth is the social cognitive perspective, says that our personality is formed through various environmental and cognitive experiences. So this is where the behaviorist perspective and social cognitive perspective sound very similar, as they both think about observational learning, behaviorism, and learning through others. But this is where the importance of cognition comes in, so social cognitive. And through observational learning, we're able to mimic positive behaviors that we observe in others. For example, if you see someone going to the gym every day and the result is a fit, muscular body, you may copy this behavior in hopes of attaining the same result. So there's a situational approach to explaining behavior, which is the trait versus state controversy. It states that the severity of someone's reaction in any given situation is dictated by their trait's personality or by the situation itself, which is the state. So the trait is the personality characteristics that are stable, long-lasting, and within oneself. Traits are generally present consistently and do not depend on the situation. Second is the state, so personality characteristics that are unstable, short-term, and subject to change according to the environment. So traits are something that do not change, but state is something that changes. So there's 3 components of emotion, similar to the 3 components of attitudes. The 3 components of emotion are... Sorry, did anyone have any questions for the personality section? So the 3 components of emotion. First is the physiological components. So it's more to do with what changes in your body, such as the heart rate might increase, muscles tense, temperature increase. When you think about like the sympathetic nervous system and autonomic nervous system etc. Second is the cognitive or thoughts and beliefs. It varies person to person. There are mental assessments that can include appraisal of what is happening, thoughts and expectations about the situation. Cognitive experiences result from emotions and can cause emotion. Third is a behavioral aspect. So emotions produce different behavioral responses, evident from body language or facial expression. Expressions vary by individual and interpreted differently, culture to culture. So this is where one question we had at the beginning in terms of differentiating the four theories of emotion. So we going over them one by one. So first is the James Lange theory. So it's the experience of emotion is due to the perception of physiological responses. So you can think about it linearly. So holding a cat, which is the event, it increases your heart rate, which is a physiological response, and then you interpret that physiological response, which leads to you experiencing happiness, which is the emotion. So it's not the cat making you happy, it's something the cat is doing to your body, which is a physiological response that makes you happy. Another example is a man who's allergic to bees encounters a bee. The man's heart rate increases. He starts sweating and he interprets these physiological changes as emotion fear. So here, the linear chain you can see, the event leads to physiological response, and then you interpret that physiological response, which finally leads to emotion. And you can remember this by JL are one apart on the alphabet. So they have a physiological response first, which leads to emotion. Second is the Cannon-Bard theory. So they disagreed with James Lange's theory and found flaws in the idea that physiological response triggered emotion. They believed that physiological response and emotion occurred simultaneously, or at the same time. For example, holding your cat, which is the event, causes your heart rate, which is the physiological response, to increase and feel joy, emotion at the same time. So before, it was physiological response to emotion, but here it's physiological response and emotion at the same time. Another example is a man who is allergic to bees encounters a bee. Simultaneously, the man's heart rate increases and he starts sweating and feels fear, which is a emotion. So here it's event, and then it branches both into physiological response and emotion at the same time. So the acronym CB are next to each other in the alphabet, so it all occurs at the same time. Physiological response plus emotion. And when I think about like Cannon-Bard, I think about a cannon going off, which happens like think about it simultaneously or instantly. So physiological response plus emotion, so they happen together. This one is the Hatcher and Singer two-factor theory of emotion. So the physiological and cognitive responses simultaneously form the experience of emotion. So if we become physiologically aroused, we don't feel a specific emotion until we're able to label or identify the reason for the situation. For example, holding your cat is the event, and that leads to a physiological response of increased heart rate, and then you label that situation and identify the reason for the increase in your heart rate and event, and which is this is really nice. I like holding my cat. This makes me feel happy. And then it finally leads to your emotion, which is happiness. So the second example is a man who's allergic to bees. He encounters a bee, and simultaneously the man interprets that his allergy to bees makes this encounter threatening. His heart rate increases and he starts sweating. He labels the emotion he is experiencing as fear. So this is also not linear. Sorry, you could think about it in this way. The event, it leads to the physiological response plus identify the reason for the situation, the PR consciously, which leads to emotion. So far we studied the James Lange theory, which was physiological to emotion here, and then Cannon-Bard, which is physiological and emotion happen together. Now this theory is physiological plus the interpretation of the cognition leads to the emotion. And then the next theory, it's easy to confuse this theory with the next theory, which is the Lazarus theory. And the difference is in the Lazarus theory, you first label the emotion and then the physiological response and emotion happen simultaneously. So the difference is in the addition over here. So there's a plus here, and then finally a motion here. And then this one, there's an arrow, and then there's two things happening at the end. Finally, the last theory, Lazarus theory, it's the experience of emotion depending on how the situation is cognitively appraised or labeled. And one thing, if you see like a passage or any question talking about label, always think about the Lazarus theory. It's really focused on the labels that you place on stuff. So if we label emotion as good, it is positive. If we label emotion as bad, it is negative. How we label the event is based on cultural or individual differences. So the event is the same, and depending on the label, it produces two different emotions. Example, activity of jumping off a plane is terrifying for some, but exhilarating for others, depending on the label. And coming back to the man who's allergic to bees example, and he encounters a bee, the man interprets that his allergy to bees makes this encounter threatening and labels it as negative. Then simultaneously, his heartbeat increases and he starts sweating and experiencing fear. And the cat example is the event, which is holding the cat and labeling the situation or praising it as happiness. And this leads to simultaneously the emotion of joy and the physiological response of increasing heart rate. So the event leads to the labeling the event or appraisal, and which finally leads to simultaneously the emotion and physiological response based on the appraisal. So this is a summary of the four theories of emotion. So you can review this diagram, which provides a good summary of all of them. So I was wondering if anyone had any questions for the theories of emotion.
This really helped. Thank you so much.
No problem. So stress. So I know everyone on the chat is not, they know how stress feels like. They're studying for the MCAT. So example, it's saying what is stress? Example, dog is chasing a rabbit, and the rabbit is most likely experiencing stress. Stress is the process by which we appraise and cope with the environmental threats and challenges. It encompasses both the stressor and the stress reaction. So the stressor is the threatening, challenging event. Example, the dog is the stressor to the rabbit, and the stress reaction is subsequent physical and emotional response. Example, the rabbit's response to the dog chasing it. And coming back to the MCAT example, so the MCAT exam could be the stressor, and the stress reaction could be you realizing how big of a task it is, and then you sit down and then you make a schedule for yourself, and then like a to-do list, and then you sort of work at it day to day. So that's your stress reaction to deal with the stressor. So Richard Lazarus, stress arises less from physical events, but more from the assessment / interpretation of those stresses / events. This is the appraisal theory of stress. There's two stages to the cognitive stages of stress. First, the primary appraisal, and second, the secondary appraisal. The primary appraisal is assessing stress in the present situation. The three categories of response to this primary appraisal is irrelevant, benign or positive, or stressful and negative. So it could be irrelevant. I see the stress, but it's not important. Benign or positive. For example, a dinosaur eats the dog, and then which is the rabbit's enemy. So it's the stressor is removed. And finally, stressor or negative. The stressor is actually threatening, and the rabbit is having to run away from the dog. If after the primary appraisal, you appraise it as negative or stressful, then you move forward into the secondary appraisal. Secondary appraisal is the evaluation of one's ability to cope with the situation. What is the individual's material preparedness to deal with the stressor? Appraisal of harm, threat, and challenge, how to overcome it. Harm is what damage has already been caused. Threat is how much damage could be caused. And third is challenge, how can the situation be overcome or conquered? So another thing in relating to stress is general adaptation syndrome, the three phases by Hans Seo. So there's alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. First is the alarm stage. So if the stress reaction kicks in, your heart races, resources are mobilized and ready for fight or flight. For example, you're about to give a presentation and your heart is racing, you're sweating. So that's sort of like the alarm phase. And then resistance is fleeing or dealing with the stressor. And the body is bathed in cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So resistance could be like reviewing your notes and then dealing with the stressor, which is the presentation. Number three is exhaustion. If resistance isn't followed by recovery, our body's stress resources are depleted, and our dampened immunity can make us susceptible to illness and the negative impact of long-term stress. So let's say you had uh, a presentation, hopefully not like every single hour of every single day for a week. So that can lead to exhaustion as you're stressed from all these presentations. So we're equipped to handle short-term stress. So let's say one presentation a day or one presentation a week. But there will be serious negative consequences if this is maintained daily or long term. So this is the diagram for the general adaptation syndrome. You can think about it in the alarm or reaction mobilization resources. So this is your stress resistance. It goes down because your body's just making a physiological response, sweating, heart rate increases, temperature maybe increases. Then you sort of want to deal with the stressor, which is resistance. And the body's resistance to stress can only last so long before exhaustion sinks in. So then the stress resistance goes down in exhaustion, and the resources are depleted. So finally, we have a practice passage. Uh, so it deals with stress. It's a stress-related passage. I'll share the link in the chat, and then we can work on it for, you can read it and answer the questions in 10 minutes, and then we can review it after the 10 minutes. Everyone can let me know when they have the a passage opened up. So now I'll add a 10-minute timer to the screen, and then you can work on the questions, and after we'll discuss them. Time is up. So it's almost 9 o'clock. I apologize for going over time. It's just there's so much to cover today. If you have to leave, this session is recorded. So question number one stated, the experimental group is likely to improve in which aspect of their stress management? A, primary appraisal, B, control of the flight or flight response, C, secondary appraisal, and D is the increase in the number of time participants call home. So I was wondering what students put for this question. You can put it in the chat if you
I have a
want.
question. To
Yeah.
see the answers, do we have to log in to see the answer?
Yeah, it kept on asking like make a account or sign in, so I just clicked sign in with Facebook.
Oh, okay. So we should sign in. Okay, no problem. Thank you. So it's C, but
Yeah, secondary appraisal. Yeah, that's the
yeah, but I put
correct answer.
A. So how do
Yeah.
we? Can you just go into that really quickly?
Yeah. So in this passage, it states social support is considered one of the most important ways of coping with academic stress. So here it's sort of like the sentence helps you differentiate primary versus secondary stress. So primary is recognizing if it's a threat or not, yes or no, and then you move on with coping with stress. So that's where you can go into the secondary appraisal of stress. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
No problem. So primary appraisal, it's recognizing if it's a stress or not. Uh, so it'd be a yes or no, positive, negative. Then you go on to secondary appraisal, control of the fight or flight response. So that's sort of like a biology type of thing. It's not really spoken about in the passage. Secondary appraisal, and so it talks about how to cope with the stressful event. So it's secondary appraisal, and they increase the number of times participants call home. So this is like beyond the scope of the passage, as they don't really talk about the number of times participants call home. Some students may, but other students may not. Question number two is which hypothesis is best supported by the results of the study? A, H1 and H2, B, H2 and H3, C, H3 and H4, D, and H3 only. So I was wondering where students put for this one. So I see 1D in the chat. So that is the correct answer. So quickly, you could go over one. So one is there is a relationship between stress and social support. So this is sort of going along the lines of a correlation. And relationship means that there's sort of like if something increases, something the other variable increases or decreases. So like a regression analysis or something like that. So in here, there's sort of like no clear relationship between stress and social support. Like if something increases, the other increases as well. So it's sort of like all over the place. There's no clear uh, relationship that you could see. But while reading this question, this was this co- this was also like a attractive answer. There could be a relationship between stress and social support, but you'll see later on why A and B would be incorrect. So H2 was there is a decrease in the moderate level of stress among students after support classes. So moderate stress is over the middle bar, and among students after support classes. So pre-experimental is here, and then right here, and then post-experimental. So you see it's 55.85, and then it goes to 56.5. So actually there's an increase in stress. So H2 is completely incorrect. It's actually an increase. So with that H2, you go into A and B both include H2, so you can cancel that out. So now it's only between C and D. H3 is included in both, so it's most likely that one's correct. So now you're just looking at H4. So inclusion in a social support class improves student success at university. So this is what sort of like where it becomes a cars type of question of going beyond the passage. There's nothing really related to this related to student success at university, like grades or other types of measures of success. Like you see stress here, you see stress and coping here, and you see stress over here. So it's beyond the passage. So H3 is the correct answer. You could also think about in gender plays a role in the management of stress. So if all the bars for male and female were very similar, then I don't think gender would play a role. But as you see, like for this one, there's different bars for males and females, so gender could play a role, plays a role in the management of stress. And this is sort of like related to cars again, is that H1 is there's a relationship between stress and social support. That's sort of like a strong claim, whereas 3 is sort of like a muted claim. It plays a role. So it doesn't really say relationship. Many things could play a role, and gender is one of those things. Question number 3, the validity of the study has been questioned due to the decrease in participation of the groups as time went on. Which modification could improve participation over the duration of the study while not invalidating the results of the study? So I see 1C in the chat, which is the correct answer. So going over the responses one by one is monetary reward based on attendance. So if you include a monetary reward based on attendance, this is an extrinsic motivator, which we spoke about earlier. So it was sort of like you don't know if it's dealing with the participation or attendance in the group, or are they coming for the monetary reward? And that's related to B, which is the course credits. Are they coming for the course credits, or is it the attendance or and other things? And making the course attendance optional, this is sort of like hard to make a experiment in this case where they had like a control group and experimental group. If you make it optional, the people who opt to go for the experimental group may be different, inherently different from the people who do not go for the experimental group. So that's makes confounds in the study. So C, improving the course content and delivery, that is a good option because it's related internally, so internal validity of the study. Four is related to what we discussed last week, which was based on the Erikson stages of psychosocial development, the participants are at which stage of the Erikson stages? So I see 1B, identity versus role confusion. So that is the correct answer. There's two ways you can answer this question. So keep in mind identity versus role confusion. So if you go back to the passage, it states that among along with academic pressures, students are seeking independence and autonomy from their parents and responsibility for themselves, acceptance from their peers in a world of mixed values and more intimate relationships. So this is directly related to identity and role confusion. A second thing you can use to answer this question is that university students were the sample. So mem if you memorize the Erikson stages of psychosocial development, uh, identity versus role confusion, 13 to 21 years of age, that's around the uh, university age or starting university. So that's two ways you could use to answer this question. And the other way is just thinking about what they state
Can you
in.
go back? Oh my God, I've never seen that. Can you just go back to that?
Yeah,
Because initially I think I put intimacy versus isolation.
yeah,
Because it was kind of talking about like, you know, social support.
yeah.
But it's identity versus um role confusion. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I just tried as much as possible just to look at the ages because sometimes they give like ages on the psychology, sociology sections, right? Sometimes like one or two questions, and yeah, you could use the ages, or you could just use the passage. Lastly,
I'm sorry, can you
number
go back one more time? Is
yeah,
it just one slide?
yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Question number 5. A criticism of the study is that there is no physical measure of stress. It is proposed that introducing a physical stressor as part of the experiment is necessary to validate the results of the experimental group. Which statement below describes a valid response to this criticism? So I was wondering what students put for this one as well. So I don't see any responses in chat, so I'll just go over them one by one. So A is the criticism is valid as humans require physical stressors to elicit a response. So far what we've been talking about is that many stressors that you experience are not physical. You don't necessarily, for example, the MCAT exam is not really like a physical stressor. A physical stressor is like a lion chasing after you, a bear chasing after you. But a exam or a test, a presentation is not a physical stressor. So you don't, it's not necessary for a physical stressor to be present to elicit a response. B is the criticism is valid as humans under laboratory conditions require a physical stressor. And this is the same thing. Uh, you don't need a physical stressor to elicit a response. It could be non-physical as well. C is the criticism is invalid as the human stress response is non-specific. So this is a good response as everyone displays stress differently, and it's not if everyone has a test, other people do the if different things like the alarm, resistance, exhaustion stages, and it's non-specific in terms of the stressor as well. It doesn't have to be physical. There's a wide variety of types of stressors. And D, the criticism is invalid as a physical stressor would elicit too large a response. And this it's sort of like going beyond, like it's stating something that you don't necessarily know from the based on the passage. As a physical stressor would elicit too large a response, as this is sort of related as it's non-specific for everyone. So one person may elicit a large response and another person may elicit a smaller response. So it's not the same thing for everyone. So in this question, C would be the most correct answer. So that's the end of the session.
Yeah,
So
that was interesting. At first I had put, if you want to go back, at first
Yeah.
I put, well, I was thinking, because at first it says like a criticism of the study is that there is no physical measure of stress. So
yeah.
I thought it meant like measuring
Yeah.
the level of stress, not actually like eliciting like a stress, like hitting someone.
Yeah.
So it was
I
kind
agree.
of,
I agree. This question was, it talks about like there's no physical measure, but then it talks about like introducing a physical stressor, which is like uh unrelated.
yeah. So that one was a little weird, but okay, yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you for this. This was good.
No problem. Thank you. There's a lot of terms for psychology, as you know, psychology, sociology. Please use flashcards or anything that works for you. Quizlet, Anki. Include examples of terms that are difficult to remember. Set a timer and review. Frequently remember decay theory. So each and every time, like the time goes on, it decays unless you review the material. Practice identifying variables in passages. Independent variable versus dependent. So this is sort of related to the passage we reviewed. There's three graphs, and you sort of this sort of like information overload. Like you don't know if you have to analyze these graphs really. So I just look at the y-axis, x-axis, and I don't really dive too deep into if there's a relationship. If it's like a correlation, a scatter plot, then I can keep it in my mind as this variable increases, the other one increases. But if you look at each bar, you it may take like 5 minutes to look at each bar. This one goes down, that one goes down. So just keeping in mind like the variables, and if the question refers to that one, then you can really dive deep into it and look at what the relationship that you're looking for. And lastly is the Khan Academy video notes, which are really good for reviewing everything as exposing yourself to as many terms as possible. So it's like preventing the stress on exam day when you see a response that you never word or term you never seen before. So thank you everyone for today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great night.